we have another round of applause for our three organizations? It is these types of partnerships that is really crucial to the fight against human trafficking. Today, we have a very special opening keynote address given by someone who works on a daily basis to fight human trafficking and bring greater awareness to the women, men, and children who live in slavery today. Mark Taylor is from the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons of the United States State Department. Mark Taylor has served as Senior Coordinator for the Trafficking in Persons Report at the State Department's Office and Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons since November 2003. Previously, Mark Taylor worked at the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria in two capacities: as the embassy's first narcotics and law enforcement affairs officer, which involved designing and implementing anti-trafficking in persons projects, and later as the embassy's corporate responsibility officer engaging oil companies, Niger Delta companies, and Nigerian police in a dialogue on human rights and security principles. In the late 1990s, he performed similar work at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India, where he opened the State Department's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs Office and started the U.S. government's first anti-trafficking persons in India. In the mid-1990s, he served as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Rangoon, Burma, covering narcotics, ethnic insurgencies, and human rights issues. Mr. Taylor has also worked in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research as an analyst of Asian crime and narcotics issues. And we are happy to welcome Mark Taylor today as our keynote speaker. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Taylor.
About some of those things I did. Thank you all for this great reception given me and my colleagues from Washington, New York, elsewhere. If you don't mind, I'd like to make this presentation here, and I will stand up and take questions at the end so that I can draw on this PowerPoint. I'd like. Can you hear me?
Testing.
Thank you. I'd like to, my presentation, start off with our global focus that we have in the Office of Monitoring and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Looking at some of the trends. Looking at some of the trends that we've seen over the last year. And focusing down on and looking at East Asia, some of the trends on trafficking as they apply to that region, and then finally zeroing in on Vietnam and the relevance of the things that we're looking at. How these trends and how these themes that we're trying to promote in the report affect Vietnam, how they relate to Vietnam. So, I think everyone has a copy of the Trafficking in Persons report that are available on the table. This is my main function in the office, is to produce this every year. I've gone through 4 of them. Basically, to frame our approach internationally, we're looking at advancing the freedom from slavery, a fundamental human right, enshrined in our Constitution and the 13th Amendment and many other countries' constitutions. Certainly many international covenants, from ILO conventions to the UN Protocol on Trafficking to the Child Rights Convention and others. Also, in this process, recognizing that awareness of the issue leads to resolve, whether that's awareness from governments, communities, and from vulnerable groups themselves. Also, the recognition that respect for human dignity, the basic human right, leads to protection of victims of trafficking. And finally, recognizing that cultures need to change fundamentally, and this will take a long term, a lot of time to do. I'm not talking about societal cultures, but legal cultures, law enforcement cultures, that have a profound effect on whether a victim is identified and ultimately assisted. Some of the themes that we promoted this year and will continue to, two are the characteristics of trafficking that we see the world over. One is debt, and the other is labor forms of trafficking. Debt, we felt, needed to be played up, needed to be given much more attention because it seems so pervasive in so many different forms of trafficking. Debt and sexual servitude. A young girl or woman who's recruited with a deceptive offer and discovers that she has to pay an exorbitant amount to make a journey or to get into a certain job. It's often fraudulent, but that debt is used as a way of coercing her to do labor or service, like prostitution, that she otherwise would not. Debt and illegal or even illegitimate recruitment of foreign migrant workers. Someone's told you have this great job waiting for you in Malaysia and Taiwan, but you have to pay $10,000 US to get it. That's not legitimate. In many countries that's illegal, but it's often the case. And finally, the unfair debt that's applied by brokers in the destination country or the employers to those workers once they arrive. Unfair costs, the cost of food, the cost of lodging, penalties sometimes for showing up late for work, for getting sick, all added onto the debt, all used as part of that coercive factor to keep them in that service or labor. And the challenge that faces law enforcement authorities, the lack of recognition. Many police agencies, immigration agencies, even social workers don't identify this as a form of coercion. They see it, but it's not, its true import isn't appreciated. Just some visuals, debt and prostitution. Heard of women once in a brothel in a coercive situation, often have fees applied. Food, clothing, cosmetics, even condoms, all this used as a way of keeping them in a state of bondage. Looking at labor, and this ties in very closely with the debt issue. Looking particularly at contract migrant labor, and people say why? Because there often is trafficking that occurs within irregular migration or illegal outside the formal sector. But this seems to us to be, one, very prevalent, and two, a bit easier to address. It's still very difficult, but easier in the sense that states or governments have a role in this, and so therefore have a responsibility to respond to it. Responsibility of source governments, they're in charge of recruiting practices, they're in charge of bilateral agreements that they sign with destination countries on how these employees will be paid, how they will be treated, how they will be repatriated if they get ill or get into trouble. Then on the destination side, what we call the demand elements, they have, of course, even larger responsibilities because of the exploitation that often shows up in the workplace, in the destination country. There's often sponsorship regimes, ways that employers or labor brokers control workers. It's all under the guise of ostensibly of keeping workers happy and making sure that both parties in the agreement, the employer and the worker, are satisfied, but often are too controlling. When someone's every movement is controlled by a sponsor because their visa, because their papers are all tied directly to that person, and if they were to walk away and they're illegal, that just opens up incredible vulnerabilities to forced labor. And the need for parity and punishment, that when these extreme forms of exploitation occur in a destination country, the conditions of forced labor, that be punished just as you would punish a sex trafficking crime. And I'll get more into that later. Export of labor, this again in the context of contract migration, is booming. Less developed countries around the world, particularly in East Asia, have actual policy of sending out their citizens to work abroad as a way of garnering foreign exchange that can be remitted. And in some countries, this is a significant part of the economy. The Philippines is a classic example. Vietnam seems to be heading in that direction. But yet some of the provisions for the agreements that are signed between these sending governments who are encouraging their citizens to go abroad, the agreements that they sign with destination countries lack any protections, lack adequate protections for victims, for workers, should they get into trouble. I've seen some of these, And I've yet to see one agreement that actually talks about forced labor, talks about involuntary servitude. Most are confined to wage and hour issues and how to repatriate workers early or when their job is done. Some even actually have pro-trafficking clauses. For example, Malaysia, which insists that every country that signs an agreement with them on labor have a provision that the employers in Malaysia can hold the passports of the workers. And we recognize this in our government as a contributing factor to trafficking, and it's actually criminalized in the U.S. Code as document servitude when holding a passport is used as a means of keeping someone in labor or service. We're also looking at products made with slave labor, and this is an area where civic activism can really play a big role, because there are products that are getting into the global marketplace that are tainted with forced labor. We've identified 3 in the last year that affect the United States. Shrimp processed in Thailand by Burmese migrant labor, many of them in very forced conditions. Pig iron produced in Brazil that relies on charcoal that's cut from the Amazon forest, that also gets into an ecological issue through forced labor. And about 80% of that pig iron in Brazil comes to the United States. Conversely, about 70% of the U.S. pig iron needed for our steel industry, for our cars, for our steel refrigerators, comes from pig iron in Brazil. And apparel made in Jordan under a U.S. free trade agreement that involves forced labor. So these are things that we're trying to look at more because as a demand country for products, we're actually part of the problem. Also, I want to point out that debt, as I mentioned earlier, as a coercive factor, was present in every one of these cases. It's been documented. And I should point out, these are all documented by NGOs, either in the U.S. or in the destination countries. Some images of labor that both convey the contract migrant labor, which I'm talking about, the use of debt. You probably know the Kosovo case, and Robert will go into this more. In the United States, we still have cases of guest workers coming to the United States that fall into highly exploitative situations from other countries. Very traditional labor within a country, like South Asia's bonded labor problem, where people are actually born into slavery and pass on a debt from generation to generation, never paying it off. Back more to the neighborhood Vietnam's in. Thailand, this is the shrimp industry I was talking about, a slave camp that was discovered last year. It was in September, with 800 Burmese migrants, men, women, and children working 20 hours a day in a barbed wire, highly secured facility with guns and watchtowers and threats of violence if they tried to escape. The pig iron issue I was telling you about in Brazil, in the Amazon region of the country, very remote, very hard to find. That debt used when men are recruited from poor areas in the north of the country to go to these charcoal camps, and then they have no way of getting out because they lack money to even buy a bus ticket. And there are many forms of child labor that meet our definition of trafficking when it's forced. And if children are, of course, in prostitution, the element of force does not need to be present. 2 other themes, and this gets to, unlike the first 2 that dealt with the characteristic of the problem, this is the government response. And this is not by any means the exclusive view of all governments' response, because we've certainly seen progress in the last year on a number of fronts, but 2 worrisome trends: indifference, the lack of political will by governments to recognize trafficking for what it is and deal with it forthrightly, and 2, complicity, the actual involvement of government officials in trafficking, whether directly or facilitating it, some say looking the other way, letting something happen without taking appropriate action. And these 2 combined present a huge challenge to making progress in the future. I mentioned the indifference, the lack of adequate laws. One thing we've noticed is that I think the international community has done a very good job of looking at sex trafficking for many years. And certainly sex trafficking continues to be a major form of modern-day slavery in the world. And as a result of that attention, laws have been improved. We've counted about 74 countries that have improved their legal structures to criminalize trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation adequately. But lagging far behind that is an effort to criminalize labor forms of trafficking, to criminalize forced labor and all of the nuances that are required, all the different levels of acts that are required in our definition of trafficking and the UN Protocol's definition, and to treat it as a true criminal issue and not just an administrative labor violation. The lack of a policy framework that actually supports laws, that tells people on the ground, whether they be immigration officers, police officers, social workers, this is an important issue. And if you're working on this issue, you're fulfilling a national policy mandate. That's often a big difference in countries where you have a law, but there's really no strong policy push to implement it. I mentioned the lack of cultures, lack of legal cultures, law enforcement cultures, acceptance of trafficking, often viewing it as through an immigration prism, that these are people who have broken the law, that have come here illegally, and not being able to get past that conceptual hurdle about immigration violations or prostitution violations if it's a case of sex trafficking, and the need to really conquer that hurdle. And of course, lack of adequate protections. When a victim is found, are they given enough time to recuperate? Are they given the opportunity to participate in a law enforcement investigation if they so choose? Are they given alternatives to being deported back to a country where they might face hardship and retribution? Trying to give good examples of lack of political will is difficult, but I did mention the issue of MOUs between countries on migrant labor. And one country in particular that stands out because of its insistence that these agreements actually have a clause that we believe strongly contributes to trafficking. That is a key sign of indifference to the issue. And it's perhaps a little unfair to pinpoint Malaysia that we've been able to access their agreements. Many of these are signed in secrecy or in privacy. They're not publicly available. You can't find them online, and that's part of this whole problem is that there's no open process in drafting these. Labor organizations, NGOs, civil society are not invited in to take part in these agreements, and yet they affect so many people once they're signed. Another trend that we see that I think falls into that framework of indifference is the sale of brides. And now I'm starting to get into more East Asia and particular things that we see. Internationally brokered marriages. Many are good. Many lead to a happy union in which both parties are satisfied. But given the lack of adequate oversight and laws, and this is indifference, it's really taken off in East Asia with Mongolians trafficked in places like South Korea and Japan, Vietnamese trafficked through this process to many countries like Taiwan, like Japan. And what's driving it is socioeconomic disparities in the region, demographics, the gender gap in particular, which is seen in China, where the ratio of men to women is widening, and you've got trafficking of North Koreans, Vietnamese, Burmese into China in order to try to satisfy that gap. And criminal networks that are taking advantage of these loose laws and lack of oversight that have yet to catch up with the internet, which is allowing much of this brokerage, and actually becoming marriage brokers themselves or enlisting marriage broker companies to help them get women into the sex trade or into labor situations in places like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Malaysia. And furthermore, exacerbating this are biased immigration and marriage laws, where in some of these destination countries, which tend to be more developed countries in Asia, like I mentioned, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, a foreigner who marries a national has very few rights for several years. And that presents a very tough situation if that marriage was fraudulent and actually intended to induce someone into servitude, because they have very little recourse from local law, very little sympathy from society in general, and if if they flee their husband, they're often illegal migrants because they're no longer with their sponsor. Some visuals, I think you might have seen this. This was in our 2006 report. It's an ad that ran frequently in a Taiwan newspaper selling Vietnamese brides, and I think it offered, if I remember correctly, two options. You could either join a package tour and go to southern Vietnam, where you would have a number of women lined up for your choosing, or you could sit in the comfort of your home and have a videotape mailed to you where you could just do your selection there and have your bride sent to you. Also in Korea, great sign, this was in our report this year with a box we wrote on this problem of international brokered marriages. Vietnamese, they don't run away. International marriage specialist. This was on a Korean roadside. Complicity. Don't have any images for you of this problem, but it's very. I think it goes without saying, very difficult to expose. Everyone's cautious about identifying exactly in detail how this problem manifests itself. Yet everyone will say, "Oh, well, everyone knows that that this police force or that section is involved." Extremely potent, extremely corrosive in limiting what law enforcement can do on trafficking, limiting what victims are willing to say to police because of the knowledge of corruption. And traffickers rely so heavily on this element of complicity. There was one country in Asia where a survey was done among traffickers, which is a pretty hard thing to do, and it found that about 70% of the traffickers operating, they were still active when they were surveyed, relied on corrupt law enforcement officials, and I think it was 58% of the total relied on corrupt politicians. Seldom punished adequately. It's something that is not confined to East Asia, but when law enforcement officers are caught and identified, which is rare enough in itself, they're seldom treated as you would a trafficking crime, sent to court, sent to prosecution, and ultimately convicted and put in jail. Instead, you have more administrative responses like early retirement or transfer to a different position. Looking more at East Asia, because of the great migrant flows that we see in East Asia, the booming economies, the policies being promoted by some governments to export its own nationals without adequate protection, highly vulnerable to trafficking particularly for forced labor. You'll see in the TIP report we have a ranking system for countries and how they do on trafficking. Because East Asia is not very high, not represented high on the chart, and we think there's a general correlation between rule of law, respect for democratic principles, respect for civil rights, and performance on trafficking. Community governments tend to see trafficking as a law enforcement issue, which it is, but it's also a human rights issue. And when law enforcement is emphasized almost exclusively or to the detriment of human rights, you don't have victim protection, you don't have good performance. And I think that is a trend in the region. You've seen our list, it's in the report. Tier 1 is our highest performing countries. There are 4 of those from East Asia. And Tier 3 is our worst performing countries. Right now we only have 1. You can see a map here that's color-coded in our TIP report. And red and orange are the worst performers. The yellow is in the middle, and the green is Tier 1. You can see the region is not above the average, with places like Burma and North Korea, which have governments actually involved in trafficking, and then poor performers scattered throughout. What makes us focus more on East Asia, why the region is so deserving of international attention on this issue, is because it has a higher prevalence of trafficking than any other region. The ILO did a study in 2005 on forced labor, and while they don't touch on trafficking, we consider forced labor to be part of the larger trafficking umbrella. They came up with a conservative, I'll say this is a minimal estimate of forced labor worldwide of 12.3 million, of which 77% are in Asia and Pacific. And that's astounding. Some will say, well, East Asia, Asia, which does include India, has two of the world's largest countries, or roughly about 25% of the world's population, so it might stand to figure that this prevalence is there. But an even more interesting analysis is the concentration of trafficking victims, or the number of victims per 1,000 inhabitants. And East Asia still wins out with almost 3 victims for every 1,000 inhabitants. And again, this is a conservative, what ILO calls a minimal estimate of problem. Also, it's worth noting that East Asia's got the largest number of state-imposed trafficking victims, and that's largely thanks to North Korea and Burma. Getting to Vietnam, where does Vietnam fit in this? Many of the factors, the trends that I've cited, very much affect Vietnam. The debt issue, the recruitment issue, the contract migrant labor, and the lack of protections offered by sending governments and destination governments all apply to Vietnam. We've seen uneven progress. I think that's reflected in our analysis in recent years. Some progress in addressing sex trafficking. There have been a number of good law enforcement actions taken. Most recently, there was a big ring broken in the South that had been sending over 120 women to Malaysia. There were others like that, but not accompanied by any great progress on the labor front, and that's what's most distressing because, as I mentioned, the labor flows out of Vietnam seem to be growing. It seems every few months there's a new agreement being signed with a destination country on Vietnamese migrants being contracted out. Places like Saudi Arabia, which are widely known as being a place where workers are exploited. What makes Vietnam unique in this situation is that the state either directly runs or controls all of the recruitment labor companies, all the exports, and that was certainly the case in the Solie case in the United States. So it has a much greater responsibility for what happens to those workers. These are not private companies that on their own decided to get into exploitation or apply unfair labor practices. They're part of the state apparatus. And yet there's no visible effort on the part of the government of Vietnam to identify and address labor forms of trafficking, forced labor, involuntary servitude among the young people it sends abroad. We just have never heard of anything reported on forced labor cases being prosecuted or addressed, either administratively, like through a labor regime, like the Ministry of Labor, Invalids, and Social Affairs, or in a criminal court, which would be, of course, what we would all want. The labor law that governs these workers going abroad appears to us to be inadequate and often allows the labor company itself to police its own activities or the activities of its contract partner, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And there's no transparency in the memorandum of understanding, governing these workers going abroad, those agreements I was talking about. Where are Vietnamese exploited? In our analysis, we've seen mostly to be, this happens most often in developed countries in East Asia, with the exception of Cambodia, because of its proximity, because of a very lawless environment in Cambodia, and a very predatory organized crime element there. So those countries that, those developed states in East Asia, largely Taiwan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. I think Malaysia and Taiwan are still the #1 destinations for the legal contract workers in Vietnam. Outside the region, some of the Persian Gulf states, and most of those are on our Tier 3 because they're so bad in protecting workers' rights and getting them out of forced labor. Worrisome is an agreement that I think was struck last year between the government of Vietnam and Saudi Arabia, which included sending women as domestic workers to the Gulf. Some also to Europe and North America, as the one case here showed. And particularly vulnerable in all of this are women that are sent for domestic work. And I think Mina from BNWDO certainly can testify to that because domestic workers are often not protected under labor laws in places like Malaysia and Taiwan. They're highly vulnerable, and just by the nature of the workplace, that it's a home and not a formal site, and that too often employers take advantage of that situation. We put 16 countries on our worst list this year. 2 of them have implications for Vietnam because there's destinations for Vietnamese workers. That's Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, and we're using that ranking, the attention that ranking gets, and the diplomatic pressure that we apply to the report to try to get some better attention and better protections for workers from Vietnam and elsewhere. I talked about those 2 sort of negative factors in the government's efforts, and that is complicity and the lack of political will. We feel that those 2 elements are slowing progress down or hitting a plateau. It's very hard to measure progress, and the most difficult question anyone can ask my office is, are things getting better? Looking the world over, are we making progress? Is this, are there enough efforts to curb this? It's very hard to answer because there's so little quantitative data on trafficking. Even our estimates of victims the world over are quite fuzzy. It's hard to measure with precision. But one thing we do have is the number of convictions and prosecutions that governments report to us on trafficking. And for 3 years, and the key there is convictions, because that is actually a sign that someone is to be punished under a criminal justice system. Everything up to that point is an intent or a desire to punish a person. And convictions have been rising for 3 years, which to us is a great sign. It shows that governments are showing greater will and actually holding traffickers responsible. They declined significantly last year, and we don't think that's an inaccurate presentation of data. We think there is a sort of stalling out, or at least we're in danger of that, and the key obstacles are those 2, and that's going to be the challenge for the coming years, is to break through that political indifference. I think it requires a number of different responses on different levels, from the very formal government-to-government representations, to media, to public outcry, to civic activism, and basically sometimes just shaming. A couple of big challenges ahead, and this applies to the region. Addressing child prostitution as trafficking still remains a problem. Too many governments see teenagers in prostitution, and I'm talking about organized prostitution where a third party is involved, like a pimp or a brothel keeper, as something other than trafficking, something bad but not quite rising to the level of trafficking, or having an age threshold lower than 18, which is the international standard in the Child Rights Convention, in the UN Protocol. And children, of course, are the most vulnerable victims in sexual exploitation. And on the issue of labor, criminalizing involuntary servitude or forced labor when it's found among migrant workers as a serious criminal offense, to separate that out from other labor violations. Too often we see a Ministry of Labor or an equivalent agency handling all issues involving migrant laborers under an administrative code, putting, for example, sexual abuse in the workplace on par with wage and hour violations. I was just reading on the way to Orange County a report from one of the destination governments that receives a lot of Vietnamese, proposal they have a protocol on dealing with foreign migrant workers who have experienced sexual abuse in the workplace, and how they would set up a panel and offer them other workplaces and other accommodations, but these were all mediated in an administrative sense. There was no sense that this is a crime that needed to be dealt with in a criminal justice system, and that's something that we really need to work on. It affects Vietnamese in many places. It affects other contract workers. Foreign workers need to be treated the same way that nationals would when it comes to serious crimes such as forced labor and sexual servitude. And I think that's about all I have. I hope we still have some time for questions and answers, which I look forward to most, to hearing